Welcome back. I'm Dr. Basil Considine, and today we're doing another installment in our Dissertation 101 series. If you are watching this on recording, we have many other webinars in the Dissertation 101 series, all designed to demystify different stages, different tasks, different chunks of writing that you will be creating and decisions that you'll be making as you refine your ideas into eventually a dissertation prospectus, proposal, full-on manuscript, and then published research. So today we're going to be talking about a common stage where you take the notes that you've written in various classes for, excuse me, for exploring a topic by writing annotated bibliographies entries, and then talking about how to turn those into literature review paragraphs. Now, we have a few slides we'll be looking at, but we'll spend the balance of our time looking at some published examples to dissect the details that make a section work well. Now, because we're looking at published literature, there is some that is, shall we say, a little easier to follow than others. So some examples that we look at may be strong, some of them may be weaker. Our purpose is to find out what makes a good one, how to recognize when those aren't present, and how to add them in when they aren't there to begin with, so that when you are approaching this task yourself, you are better prepared to write information that flows, that makes sense, that has a clear purpose, and does not need to be rewritten or cut. So we're going to be looking at things in this order, starting with looking at some of the more common paragraph errors that you might see in the literature review. And we're going to divide these into two basic categories. The big three, and these are more big picture concerns. Does your literature review have a clear and logical structure? And does it have the component elements that we're expecting? If all of the body of your review is one big section with no subheadings, it probably doesn't have a very clear structure. Those headings help us see where the information is organized and how it is grouped, explains why you're not discussing some things in a section because it's a section on that particular focus. And also, we expect certain things like an introduction at the beginning of each section or subsection to tell us why this is important, why it's being discussed. Credibility and validity are related, but not quite the same thing. And the short version is we're looking at, is this a convincing argument? And is it relevant to the thing that you're trying to do? And then the writing and stylistic issues. Can you read this and understand what's going on? And is it appropriate for the genre? So we once had a student come in and they had all of their citations in AMA style, the American Medical Association style, because that was what they used at their workplace. Now, AMA to APA is relatively easy to do because they're both very fact-based, evidence-based writing style. And although there's some differences in the formatting of the citations and of abbreviations, things like that, they're close enough that that's something where you could just hire an editor and the editor would work on it for a couple hours and boom, that most of your manuscript would be in APA style. But I've also had students come in where, for one reason or another, they were working in a very different style that was familiar to them, Chicago manual style. Now, there are all sorts of different phrasing things that are different about Chicago manual style, as well as the way that they use footnotes versus parenthetical citations in APA style. Because in APA style, every sentence where you're introducing factual information should have a supporting citation in that sentence. In Chicago manual style, it's very common to just have all your sources listed in one footnote at the end of the paragraph. And so it's hard to see where the information came from and which exact sentences are providing information from which exact sources. So you want to make sure that your style is pertinent to this. And for any ACU terminal project from ACU Online, it should be an APA style. Now, here are 7 common types of errors that crop up all the time in literature review paragraphs. First is an over-reliance on low-quality sources. So for example, unless you were doing media studies, you probably don't want to rely on descriptions of research that have been written up in, say, a local newspaper or even a national newspaper like the New York Times. Because while certainly the New York Times has some great investigative journalism, they, because they are limited by newsprint, they don't print many of the details on the sources that they use. And that makes it very hard to know where all this information is coming from and the quality of some of those things. So you want to make sure that you are depending primarily on peer-reviewed journal articles, and that you are looking at things that are current and that have been through a process of some rigor in review. At the same time, there are some things that you do want to include because it's very important and something that's landmark or seminal in the field, and that leaving it out might create the impression that you hadn't done your due diligence. And this will vary depending on your specific topic. But here's what you shouldn't do. If you're in nursing studies, unless you're specifically dealing with things that Florence Nightingale was writing on or teaching on, you probably don't want to give us a history of the nursing profession, because that's not irrelevant, but not directly relevant to the task at hand. Now, same thing with Horace Mann in education. Yes, he is a pioneer for many things, but you need to demonstrate that it's actually relevant to this. Now, on the other hand, if we're talking about the current education system in the United States, yeah, you're probably going to be talking about things like Common Core and No Child Left Behind if you're dealing with things about standardized tests, because so much about how our standardized tests taking works at the state and national levels is influenced by both of those. And while some things were replaced, many aspects of the No Child Left Behind Act are still in place today, 20 years or so later. Lack of current literature. So you may have heard of the requirement for current sources, or primarily current sources. And there is something of a variation on what that is, because some areas move faster than others. Some areas are more researched than others, but there's a general agreement that 80% or more of sources published in the last 5 years, people generally agree that that constitutes recent research. Now, you want to make sure that it's 5 years when you have your defense. So if you start counting 5 years back from right now and you're just starting your courses, well, some of that's no longer going to be 5 years or less by the time you get to your defense. So often people will start counting 3 years back to help ensure that more of their sources will still be current when they get to their defense. Description or summary instead of integration and synthesis. So just telling us, oh, these researchers did X, isn't nearly as helpful as telling us, well, what was new or what was special about their findings, and how does that relate to the thing that you're doing right now? Irrelevant or unfocused content. This is related to the previous thing. If you have information and it's not clear how or why it's relevant, even if it actually is, if we can't tell that, it's going to make the reader have more trouble following the important things and possibly lose track of the different ideas. Chapter structure and layout, we talked about this in the last webinar. You want it to be very clear what information is going where, and having things that change how you would interpret what comes after be earlier. So your literature search method should be very close to the start of the chapter. Your conceptual or theoretical framework should be before the body of your lit review. Plagiarism, I hope that doesn't need explanation, but let's just briefly touch on that. You should always be clear when writing that you have in your document is yours and when it's being written by someone else. If it's being written by someone else, it must be marked as a quotation. whether that's with quotation marks or for something 40 words or longer as a block quote. If you leave out a reference, you are taking credit for other people's ideas, and that is also considered plagiarism at ACU. So make sure that you periodically run your document through Turnitin so that you are doing your due diligence to make sure that you have marked all quotations correctly, because it would be a very unpleasant surprise if you've got it all the way to the defense and then they look at it and say, hold on, you need to rewrite a whole bunch of things, cancel the defense, reschedule in 3 months, and then you're like, oh man, I was ready to be done. I have a job that requires that I have this. So let's avoid any unpleasant surprises. Turnitin is a helpful tool for making sure that you've done everything and to make sure that you are properly crediting your sources. And if you have trouble with that or interpreting the report, you can always come to the Writing Center and we'll help with that. All right, so there's some types of feedback that you might get from faculty members and the literature review that I've taken note of because I see them so often in comments that students forward to us. Things like poor flow, which is usually they can't tell how these ideas are fitting together, why you're discussing this study. It usually comes down to missing topics, sentences. A comment about distracting or irrelevant details. That's either information that should be cut because it's not part of your argument, or you need to make it clear how or why that is relevant. Unclear importance. Yeah, if there's no analysis or synthesis, as that's not going to help us figure out why this is important. You say, oh yes, they had these findings, okay, but how does that compare to something else? We need analysis. All right, they found that 60% of teachers do X and they had a great sample size. All right, well, what should we do with this information? What does that suggest should be done next, or should be looked at or considered? And if you get a comment like this is difficult to read, or sometimes this is painful to read, it's usually saying they're missing logical bridges that help you track the flow of ideas and see, okay, how does this relate to other things? And you will in older writings generally see fewer logical bridges because there was a assumption among many academic writers that any reasonably intelligent person would fill in the gaps. And that's still used in some types of academic writing, especially in Europe. But that is kind of predicated on people having a common educational and reading experience to be able to reliably come to the same conclusion that you do. To give an example, I am one of 11 children. Now, is 11 children, is having 11 children a blessing or a curse? That kind of depends on your point of view. Some people are like, oh my God, that's a nightmare. One tires me out. And other people would say, oh, wow, that would be amazing to have so many children. Now, I very much like my family and how we turned out, but I recognize that it's a blessing that's not for everyone. And how you trace out those connections with your logical bridges will make it clear whether you are presenting something as good, bad, concerning, requiring additional thought, and other things like that. And also you might see a comment like, I'm not sure why this is here because the information doesn't seem to fit with the rest. And in that case, you either want to move it or place it somewhere where it is going to have more clear meaning, which could be adding something like logical bridges or a topic sentence to bring that out. So let's go ahead and take a look at this example here. If you saw this in a lit review, a paragraph, I'd have some questions about why you are telling me this information, and try and guess which information doesn't have a clear relevance as I read this. In this brief self-published book, Pastor Alfred Pennyworth Gerald McCants, 2021, described an expansive vision for adaptive ministry in the United States that produces transformed disciples in the present generation. McCants was born in San Diego, California, and lived in 12 U.S. states. In the book, he describes his own experience of being thrust into a new career dimension by the COVID-19 pandemic. Although McCants frames this as a shift for the better, there are frequent digressions on topics such as texting, emailing, social media, live streaming, video conferencing, etc. For example, many paragraphs are spent on video games as well as virtual devotional live streams, weekly small group video meetings, and enhanced weekly electronic newsletter. Now, something that I do want to make clear is that this is not necessarily a bad paragraph for certain contexts. If this was coming from a book review that was published in, say, the San Diego Weekly Reader, which does do book reviews and has a focus on local authors, having some things like, oh, the author was born in San Diego, California, could be relevant to the readers. But if this is going in your literature review chapter, many of those details that would make it relevant for a specific audience are probably not important. So, for example, is the fact that it's a brief self-published book not terribly relevant if we're concerned with the ideas. The fact that the person is a pastor, maybe, maybe not. It depends if you're discussing something specific about ministry, where knowing that it's that specific perspective is important or not. Their first and middle names, probably not relevant here. The fact born in San Diego, again, if it was for a publication covering local authors, yeah. Most other things, including a dissertation lit review chapter, probably not. You know, how they're framing the ideas. Well, we're not trying to summarize the book in a lit review chapter. We're trying to summarize the key details and explain how or why they are relevant to the work that you are doing. So the fact that there may be frequent digressions is kind of irrelevant for most lit reviews. Okay, let's go ahead and let's look at an example from the published literature. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to look at an example here. And I'd love to invite the people watching right now to suggest a topic, something that you would like to see a search on, something that interests you. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a search here for literature review. And we're also going to do a search here for veteran teacher. We'll make that plural. And so we'll start with that as a keyword search. And we see that we have a number of different things that have come up here. Now, here we have, this is an article, genre, it's 2015. I like this. I think that would be an interesting thing to look at. But if you're doing this as part of the research for your literature review chapter, or for annotated bibliography entries that you're going to later change, you would want to make this search for something that is more recent than 2015. Not to say that you can't include it if it's important, but you want the majority of your searches to be more clearly relevant and current. So I'm going to take a look now at this one instead. Now, this is an article that was published in the Cambridge Journal of Education. It's a prestigious peer-reviewed journal. And you can see that it's somewhat substantial, and it does have some diagrams here. So we'll take a look at those. So let's go ahead and we'll look at the PDF full text. I generally recommend the PDF version because then it's very easy for you to download and save that to your computer so you can look at it later. Now we see that this is written in a style that is similar to APA style, but it's not APA 7th edition. I can tell because they have this, that's an APA 6th edition. And in fact, it looks like it was copyrighted in 2017. So even though it came out in 2018, it was a little older. And so looking through here, we have a great summary paragraph here. So let's take a look at this. A look at the international research literature. That's great. Their topic sentence is saying, hey, they're looking at literature going beyond the country that they're located in. A look at the international research literature shows that some studies on VTs portray them as disengaged, with diminishing levels of satisfaction, commitment, and enthusiasm over time. So they make a claim and they back it up with 3 different citations. Now, let's back up now and look at VT, veteran teacher. So ordinarily, something here might be problematic. Tell me if you see what might be an issue in that first sentence. You note that the studies show their dates, 1993 and 2006. Now, that might be a problem in some areas, but if we look at where, for example, US service people would have served in an armed conflict, well, 1993, that's the aftermath of the first Persian Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. In 2006, that's looking at a wave of veterans who served in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And so because of those cyclical things, there are going to be some gaps in the literature where you don't have people who've recently completed their service becoming teachers immediately or soon after, just because of the nature of the conflicts. So while the fact that many of these are older, there's actually a good reason for that. And so that is not necessarily a problem here, but for another topic, we might be saying, well, hold on. Now, if we're looking at veteran teachers to mean someone who's been in the profession for a long time, as they say in this sentence, and well, that is a different thing where because of the shorter things and teacher retirement waves and stuff, there's often some lag on that. So which type of veteran teacher are we looking at? Well, they discuss some literature and then they specify, okay, although those were using something different, from here on, veteran teacher will be used this way. Very helpful thing. Okay, now if we look at here, we have a great example of the literature method section. So especially if you watched the previous webinar, this is telling us the parameters of their search. They were looking on literature mostly published in this 11-year period. And then they tell us that, oh, their search finished in May 2016. So anything after that is not within the scope here. And they tell us the databases they used. They tell us some of the parameters for looking at different publications. And they say that they first identified 8 studies on this. And given that, this would explain something about the length. They're showing, hey, we looked for these things. There wasn't a lot of that. And so we went and we looked for more. And so they found 11 more that didn't come up with those search terms, but they found were relevant. So they're explaining why there are more things discussed here than they initially had, which is great. And then if we're to go down into the results, so this is the section that is analogous to the body of the literature review in a dissertation chapter 2. And you'll see that here they're taking a simple way of introducing. So they say, oh, here's why we're doing it. In order to provide a global review, as a global view on the nature of the papers examined, this section discusses the most relevant results in terms of the focus, methods, and characteristics of the sample. That's a great sentence. It's telling us why the things discussed in this section are being highlighted in this section. Great. And they give us kind of an overview of, oh, these were the 2 that were most directly involved in exploring this, but these other ones were also examining some relevant things. And then, okay, here they're subdividing it. So we get a sense of, why each of these different studies that's been mentioned has been included. Here are some helpful numbers. You're not required to have this, but it's helpful for demonstrating the breadth of your literature review. And if you're commenting about there being gaps, say that you're going to do a quantitative study because there weren't many found, that's very helpful for justifying what you might be doing in chapter 3. And you can see that they have described several scenarios here that they've collected in subsections of this larger topic. And here is a great example of analysis in action. So this sentence says, Bennett et al. Found that the longevity in the field could be explained by children-related personal, spiritual, or family reasons. And then they have a logical bridge here that is essentially saying, hey, here's some stuff that goes with that. We found similar stuff writing about the importance of family coming from Guende 2007 and Meister and Ahrens 2011. All right, so let's take another look here. So this is their topic sentence. They're summarizing the theme. School was a space which most of the teachers interviewed felt they belonged and that transformed their evolving identity. And then they explain what that means by quoting from this source. And then they do a brief summary of what McIntyre also wrote on that. And then they connected that back to their larger topic. Here, they summarize the key findings from McIntyre and then point out that, hey, there are similar things coming from these 4 other studies. Now, this one is more analysis where they're looking and saying, wait, well, just because these sources here said colleagues were super important, here's a bunch of stuff that emphasizes that administrators and head teachers are very important. So we're getting these 2 different things and saying, well, they're not mutually exclusive. They seem to both be happening. And then here's another finding and some analysis to put that into perspective. All right, let's look at 1 or 2 more examples. Here is a great example of how to conclude things. So if you were ending your literature review chapter, you might have something like this. This study has provided an overview of the literature on VT's identity and has analyzed the issues in relation to the teacher's personal, situated, and professional scenarios. Figure 1 synthesizes these scenarios. That's great. They've given a graphic to encapsulate the findings. Now, are you required to generate a graphic for your lit review chapter? No, but I believe both of our doctoral programs have assignments where they have you do this for literature search, and it's strongly suggested that you do it because this provides a big picture of how the findings correlate, how they interact with each other in a way that you could spend pages writing, but the graphic just makes very clear. And so this is the kind of thing that often people will include near the start of the lit review. There's a question in the chat. What book should we use for the lit review? Well, if I'm understanding that correctly, the question is, what book should you use to guide your lit review? What I would say is you want to start with the EDD dissertation and handbook or guidebook, because that lays out the specific program expectations. Now, within that, there are many other books that will offer advice on writing a lit review chapter, but I find that most students, once they see what the ACU expectations are, they're able to use models from published dissertations more effectively than just reading the book. Now, that's worth a digression, so let me open up some documents that we can look at here. So one of these is, we're just going to briefly look at the ACU conference the ACU concept proposal template that is used by students in our EDD program. And looking at this, you can see that there's a very basic structure. Okay, what's the assignment? What's the problem? What's the purpose? How are you going to go out looking at it? And then a review of the literature. And that's for an early stage of that. Now, if we were to look at a different document, the dissertation handbook, we see that there are very specific expectations for different things. If you're not familiar with it, this 7 dissertation milestones is always a good thing to keep in mind what you're expected to do at each stage, what your assignments are leading to or feeding towards at each point. Now, you'll be writing the lengthy literature review. You'll do some of it in the concept proposal, but you'll have that whole chapter being written as part of the prospectus. Now, you'll see this document is only 12 pages. It's not the only place where we have information on it. This is more the get a big picture overview. And so if we look at, for example, one moment. If we look at the EDD dissertation content guidelines, this document here, so the dissertation content guidelines go into much more specific detail about what to have in each section. So if we look at the literature review section, that's starting down here on page 14. So they talk about some of the things that you're supposed to do. And so we've talked about many of these: identifying gaps, identifying seminal works, the methodologies and research techniques people are using, specific ones you've chosen and why, how these relate. But we have this walkthrough here. Begin with a summary of the problem and purpose of the study, and introduce the questions the reviewer will answer in the major constructs. Describe your search strategy, where you looked, any parameters there, and then discuss the research that you found and the theory. In this case, it's referring shorthand to the theoretical conceptual framework, and have this be organized in some set of topics where it's clear that there's a progression. And when you're not going, oh, let's discuss the most current one, let's go back. No, if you're discussing a topic, show how it's changed over time. So do the older ones before the newer ones. Now, we have some more guidelines here. And if we look at this section here, so we are on page 16 of the document. We have 2 specific recommendations here. I'll go ahead and copy and paste those into the chat. So there's literature review, 6 steps to success, and destination dissertation, both of which have a detailed walkthroughs of ways that you can structure parts of your literature review. So those are great resources. They were actually, the destination dissertation was actually first recommended to me when I was a doctoral student, and there was what became the current book was being presented in various guises. Now, there's a little bit more about the organization here, and you'll see that there are some sentences about how you want to present the information. It's just basically the same thing we've been talking about earlier. Not just describing and summarizing, but have a clear topic that connects us to the larger theme of the section, and use logical bridges to create a clear flow, and make sure that you are discussing what these things mean together. That's the synthesis, and to analyze them in relation to other findings. That's the evaluate. So yeah, there's a good question. And again, want to emphasize that there are different specialized documents prepared to be your main resource at different points. This one that we're looking at is called the EDD Dissertation Content Guidelines, and you can download it from your masterclass, or just ask your chair if you've been assigned one for the latest copy if you are having trouble finding it. Any other questions before we wrap things up? All right. Well, if there are no other questions, we will finish early for now, because we are in week 0 and it's a time to rest, rejuvenate, and get ahead on all the things you want to. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to follow up by contacting us at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. You can schedule an appointment with the Writing Center for help, feedback of any sort, but including in this case on getting feedback early on in your literature review, writing, or planning process. We do have students who submit outlines or who send us a section and say, hey, I'm having trouble organizing this. Can you give me any insights into this? And we'll weigh in. And you can also visit the Online Writing Center for videos in our Dissertation 101 series, and specifically on courses and assignments in the EDD program. With that, thanks for coming. Have a great night.